How is everyone? This is Forward Ministry. Let me see if I can get this camera right. I can't remember what we were talking about the last time I was teaching, but the group and I have moved into Exodus, and we are going to be breaking down the book of Exodus. This camera is going to drive me nuts. I need to find my new one. So, I'm going to try and go through Exodus 1. We will go chapter by chapter. There's no way I can do more than one chapter on a video. It just takes too long. And so in Exodus 1, and I think I'm using the net version for this particular Bible study. I will not do that again. I didn't like that translation for this particular Bible study. But in Exodus 1, it starts off, these are the names of the sons of Israel who entered Egypt. Each man with his household entered with Jacob, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Ashkar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the people who were directly descended from Jacob numbered 70, but Joseph was already in Egypt, and at that time Joseph and his brothers and all that generation died. The Israelites, however, were fruitful, increased greatly, multiplied, and became extremely strong, so that the land was filled with them. So in verses 6 and 7, it specifically says that Joseph and his brothers had died, and the Israelites continued to grow and populate, and they became extremely strong, and they filled the land. So Jacob entered into Egypt, which is now Israel, with about 70 people. And God was now fulfilling the promise that he had given to Abraham in Genesis 12, that he would make him a great nation. And at this point in Israel's history, it's estimated that there's about 12 million Israelites in Egypt. So these were not a weak people, but a strong people, and really a robust people, a sturdy people, hardworking people. And they were a blessing to Pharaoh when they first entered into Egypt. But that king had died, and a new king had ascended the throne, and he was not kind to the Israelites. And so when we move on into the story, it says, Then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power over Egypt. He said to his people, Look at the Israelite people, more numerous and stronger than we are. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will continue to multiply, and if war breaks out, they will ally themselves with our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. So they put 4 men, or taskmasters, over the Israelites to oppress them with hard labor. As a result, they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread. As a result, the Egyptians loathed the Israelites, and they made the Israelites serve rigorously. They made their lives bitter by hard service with mortar and bricks, and by all kinds of service in the fields. Every kind of service the Israelites were required to give with rigor. So what we're seeing here, the Israelites had first entered into Egypt as a free people and guests of Pharaoh. They were related to Joseph, and so they were Pharaoh's guests. They were not a conquered people. They were not servants when they first entered into Egypt. And so there are really 2 pictures that are going on in this paragraph. There's a small picture and a big picture. The smaller picture was that Pharaoh was fearful at this point. This particular king is fearful, and fear led him to irrational thinking and harsh treatment of really loyal, hardworking, peaceful people that could have been his allies, which in the end caused him great harm. The bigger picture is that the devil is once again on the move, trying to get rid of the nation of Israel, trying to get rid of the promised Messiah, trying to get rid of salvation. And so the object was to do away with God's chosen people by any means he can, a holy people called to a holy mission, which was to bring salvation to the world. And so there are 3 tactics that the enemy tries to use to destroy God's people that we're going to see within the next couple of chapters. One is harsh living conditions and a hostile work environment. The second are the midwives, to be unscrupulous with the birth of the male infants. And the third will be the Egyptians themselves, and they will be called to murder the infant and young boy babies. And so verse 8 really gives us a description of Pharaoh, and he's an unrighteous man which I think is made more evident the more God attempts to contact him, the more God attempts to communicate with him, the more his unrighteousness is revealed. And so Pharaoh wanted to oppress the Israelites, which means to keep them down in hardship. And his motivation was purely selfish, and I believe inspired and motivated by the devil, the enemy of God's people and God and God's will and what God's about. And so Pharaoh wants control, but nobody can control what God is doing and what God has set forth. So what I think we can take from this right now is that as God's people, we're called to help liberate people from sin by introducing them to God's love through Jesus Christ. Pharaoh had no intentions of liberating or assisting God's people to worship the Lord, to worship Yahweh. And so he's considered and called the child of the devil. And so what we see the devil do is and what we've seen him do throughout the chapters, is oppress, persecute, and try and crush us. And so this particular king, unlike the last Pharaoh, does not rule with fairness or righteousness. His motivation is just selfish gain. What we do know is that the enemy cannot keep God's plan from moving forward. And God's plan is going to move forward for the Israelites. God always prevails. And so the Hebrews kept growing in number. And starting in verse 15, it says, "The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah," those names, "when you assist the Hebrew women in childbirth, observe at the delivery. If it is a son, kill him. But if it is a daughter, she may live." But the midwives feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. And the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said, "What have you done? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for the Hebrew women are vigorous. They give birth before the midwife gets to them." So God treated the midwives well, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. The Pharaoh commanded all his people, "All sons that are born you must throw into the river, but all daughters you may let live." So when the harsh living conditions and work environments didn't bring disaster on the Israelite population, the Pharaoh, at this point, this particular Pharaoh, resorted to do something drastic. He summoned the midwives to do his dirty work. And reading this really hit home with some things that are going on in our nation right now concerning pro-life and pro-choice. So I felt like this chapter and the group and I discussed what's going on in New York and Virginia, in morality, and that we don't have the right to liberate people from the standard that God set. God sets the standard of morality, and we don't have the right to, or the authority to, liberate people from that. We can only help people understand that morality standard better and help them try and reach it. We don't have the authority to judge them, and we don't have the authority to enforce it, but we certainly don't have the authority to excuse them from it either, which I think a lot of church people want to do at this point in this dispensation. But when the harsh labor conditions didn't bring disaster on the Israelites, Pharaoh wanted the male babies killed off. And so what we see is everyone has a right to walk in righteousness or unrighteousness, morality or immorality. And just because the majority of people have accepted unrighteousness as normal does not give God's people permission to do so, nor does it mean that God has approved it. When civil law contrasts God's law, we have the right to reject it. Obedience must reflect our loyalty to God at all times. And so we have a duty to uphold our conscience and conviction that God gives us. When what we see in this particular passage with the midwives and birth and killing of the babies, the command, is that Moses' laws are not set in place yet because Moses hasn't been born at this point. But the natural law that was given at creation is still in effect. And murder was not part of that natural law. And so originally, we were not designed for death. That's not what God intended for us. Of course, sin changed all of that. And so the midwives feared God enough to say, "I can't partake." in this horrific immorality to kill these newborn babies that are getting ready to be birthed. And so, it's speculated that how they did that without committing treason was that they showed up late to the birthing process, and that way they could truly say, look, they gave birth before I could get there, and so they weren't really lying, and they weren't really committing treason. And Warren Westerby points out that more than likely Pharaoh's motive, and I agree with him, was to kill off the male Israelites, forcing the girls to marry Egyptians, which would eventually fade the Israelite race out. The Israelite race would be absorbed by the Egyptian race, which is what Warren Westerby speculates, and I probably agree with him. And so again, it was just another way for the enemy to try and again get rid of God's chosen people and the Messiah that would come later on. And so I want to point out that the midwives feared God, and this was in contrast to the foremans or the taskmasters that were set over the Egyptians, who enforced really crucial, just horrible labor laws on these poor people. They were cruel and harsh labor laws. The midwives feared the Lord and rejected, that kind of attitude. And because they feared the Lord, God rewarded them. God responded to that. And so again, this is very much unlike Pharaoh, who has no fear of God at this point. And so when Pharaoh realized he couldn't get the midwives to kill the male infants, his debauchery just got worse. And this is what, to me, out of control fear looks like. This is absolutely the working of the devil, trying to extinguish the Messiah's lineage any way he could. And so the midwives refused to do it. So Pharaoh said, well, I'm going to call on all the citizens to kill the male babies. And so that's what he does. He calls on the Egyptian citizens to enforce his demands. Every citizen at this point was a spy for Pharaoh and kept watch on their Hebrew neighbors to see if they had a male child. And then they were commanded to take that child down to the Nile River, a river that was worshipped in Egyptian culture, and to throw them in and watch them drown. And so it was really such an ugly predicament that they were in, because if you didn't drown the baby, or these little male boys, probably 2 years and younger, you were going to be in treason with Pharaoh. And so, it's just an ugliness. And again, what we see is that we can't liberate people from the morality standard that God has set. That morality standard that God set is deeply, deeply intertwined with natural law, with the natural law that was set forth at creation. And I think life is precious, and reason for us to protect it. And so this is really a picture of how evil the devil really is, and how low his accomplices will go and stoop to assist him. And that's one reason why the midwives stood out. And so that's chapter 1. I don't want to get into chapter 2, which is the birth of Moses. I hope, going over chapter 1 kind of gave you a different insight into the beginning of Exodus. I will do another video for Exodus 2, the birth of Moses. I just don't have time to do it, and I don't want a 30-minute video on here, so we're going to break it up into hopefully 15 to 18-minute segments when we do this Bible study. But anyway, I hope that gave you some food for thought. I don't believe in forcing faith on people, bullying people into faith. I do, however, believe in morality, and the morality that God has set for us. I believe in loving people in any condition they're in. That doesn't mean I have to accept their lifestyle, but it does mean that I love them and I want good things for them, and I certainly want them to receive the love that Jesus Christ has for them. I don't have the right or authority to condemn someone to hell, nor do I want that responsibility. But I do have the responsibility as a Christian to love people and to love them well and to display God's grace to them. And should they reject that, then I have the ability to walk away in peace and wish them peace. And so, anyway, I hope you've gotten a different perspective. Until then, I hope you are blessed and you love people well.